I'd like to begin with a poem, Episodic Insomnia. Every night for a month he wakes between 3 and 4, perplexed by the routes he took around the Eastern Mediterranean years ago, following sea tracks or mountain paths, or those alleyways between tall, decrepit buildings that hide or reveal a dome or minaret, glimpsing moments of a half-remembered journey. Or else he is mistaken, and it is not the journey that wakes him, but the need to write about it. And his alarum is this hypnopompic camel trotting over memory's garbage tip, intransigent, determined. How is it that we reach that state in which the thing remembered merges with its remembering, the act of writing with the object of that need to tell and tell? And so he wakes again at 3:45, another dream journey nudging him tetchily into wakefulness, like a creature in search of its soul. And this time he is peering from a terrace on the milky heights at Galata, or else gazing eastward from the battlements at Rhodes, and wondering whether he has always confused the journey with the writing of it, whether the two things have finally become one. I've been asked to speak a little about my writing, which is always a difficult task because it means one has to begin somewhere. And I am never sure how or even when the business of writing all began. But since the metaphor of the journey is so universal, and since so much of my writing concerns individuals who are making journeys or else have chosen a kind of exile, it seems a very fitting analogy. So I'm happy to sketch out some parts of my own journey as a writer. In one of her letters, Virginia Woolf claims, "A sight, an emotion, creates this wave in the mind long before it makes words to fit it. And in writing, one has to capture this and set this working, which has nothing apparently to do with words. And then, as it breaks and tumbles in the mind, it makes words to fit it." I think of myself as a writer whose first impulse to write is inspired by a wave in the mind, as Woolf describes it, perhaps the sight of a bicycle propped against a wall, or the way that evening sunlight catches a swinging wooden gate, or a dome or minaret, as in the poem I have just read. In other words, I am struck by the details of things, events, visual impressions, perceived either directly or else dislocated by the passage of time. And eventually one of these images will prompt a speculative sentence. And after a few lines, to borrow a wonderful phrase from John Berger, I let the words slip back into the creature of language, where they are instantly recognized and greeted by a host of other words with whom they have an affinity of meaning or of opposition, of alliteration or rhythm. And I find links, and the words make other contributions and perhaps more divergent and surprising connections. I work in 4 areas of what we might term literary production. First, there is my fiction, which I talked about yesterday in my event with Neil. Then nonfiction, the long essay or memoir. Then there is my poetry, and fourth, translation from Spanish. For the purposes of this discussion, apart from a couple of poems, I will be reading my nonfiction, although, as Jeff Dyer says, fiction and nonfiction, they're always bleeding into one another. And in one sense, I would rather not distinguish between these genres at all and refer to both simply as narrative. Narrativa, in fact, is the term used for both fiction and non-fiction in the Spanish-speaking world. And for most purposes, I too am happy to blur the distinction. In fact, although I work in different genres, I think of all my writing as one concerted effort, a single, if many-layered enterprise. In my early teens, I was always going to be a composer, not so much a musician, I must confess, as I was never a gifted instrumentalist, only a very middling pianist. And the story I sometimes tell my students is that at the age of 15, I read a story in translation by the German writer and sculptor Christoph Meckel, which changed my mind and made me want to write instead. I'm sure that this is an oversimplification, but it serves a purpose, as all such tales do, so I'll stick with it. The story was called The Lion, and it completely turned my head. This melancholy and magical story is about a solitary man who befriends a lion, and it unraveled for me the need for fiction to adhere to any single received understanding of reality, a notion that I found compelling. It became a kind of paradigm of what could be achieved in 3 or 4 pages of well-crafted prose. For most of the decade of my 20s, I traveled around the shores of the Mediterranean. It came about through a series of circumstances that I now find painful to recall, as I struggled with my demons and maintained a life of vagrancy over 7 years, which ended abruptly with a near fatal bout of pneumonia and an extended stay in a Barcelona hospital that saved my life. I have written about these years in a memoir, The Vagabond's Breakfast. But before discussing that period of reckless travel, I'd like to share a poem that reflects the sort of choice that confronts anyone setting out on a journey, whatever that journey might represent. It borrows its central conceit from a famous poem by Robert Frost, and it's called The Road Not Taken. There was a fork in the track. I chose one of them, assuming the other to be the road not taken. After a few minutes, I returned to the fork, chose the other one. It looked much the same as the first, though I knew that by taking it, I was messing with fate. Within an hour or so, the road originally taken had become the road not taken, and I had to invent some kind of alternative destination for it. I decided that all outcomes are, to a large extent, the result of will. It was then that I realized I had lost my shadow. This poem suggests that whatever the possibilities offered up by one path, one route, there will always be others, actually, an infinite number of others, not taken, and that these options are not necessarily limited by time. Not long ago, I watched a documentary about Hugh Everett, the physicist who first proposed the many worlds theory or the multiverse hypothesis, which later became adopted by many working in the field of quantum mechanics. And it struck me as remarkably salient in that it corresponded, as far as I could understand it, with what I had always believed about time and the continuity of the past in the present, and potentially the future in the present also. The appeal of the multiverse theory, when I first encountered it, in which with each millisecond the universe splits and keeps splitting, seemed to me a wonderful and even reassuring concept. And whether or not it was in fact true, it served its purpose as an allegory. And as I have suggested, it fitted in with what I had always felt as a child and experienced as an adult, to follow the imagination's trajectory, to adapt to new realities as an act of will. Of course, as in the poem, there are certain risks that come with this sort of attitude. You are, in a deep sense, messing with fate. The risk of losing one's shadow, or even of becoming your own ghost or doppelganger, is ever present. I had set out at the start of the 1980s, disillusioned with life in London, where I had moved from rural mid Wales several years earlier, and I had bought an old fishing boat in the town of Chania, Crete. I stayed there 3 years, more or less, going on fishing trips along the coast and to nearby islands, or else on long hikes in the mountains, sometimes for weeks on end, and taking seasonal work on the oranges and olives. I also held down a job on and off at an especially insalubrious fish restaurant in Chania called Todipoto, the Two Doors. Todipoto no longer exists, but for a time it was the go-to eatery for the down-and-out detritus of Northern European youth, stoned hippies stranded on their way back from India, and sailors from both the Greek and the US navies, the latter based at the Sixth Fleet in nearby Suda. As the restaurant's only waiter, I had my time cut out, serving food to customers in 4 or 5 languages, as well as helping the owner, Michailis, to maintain order when one of the almost nightly fights broke out. It was an interesting time and furnished me with material for a novel many years later called Deep Hanging Out, a sort of Cold War thriller in which the premise, just as it had been in real life, was the game of identifying the Soviet spy in town. Inevitably, there was one at this stage of the Cold War, in a place with such an important naval base. The journey has been a recurring obsession of literature since Homer, and when living in Greece in my mid-20s, I was particularly taken with and clearly influenced in my writing of poetry by the Greek poets Konstantinos Kavafis, George Seferis, and Yannis Ritsos. I even went on a kind of pilgrimage to Monemvasia to explore Ritsos' hometown. I met the poet's sister in the restaurant she owned. She, like Ritsos at the time, must have been in her 70s, and I spent a long afternoon talking with her. Strangely, I was the only customer in the place. I wonder now what she made of me, this disheveled, rambling fan of her famous brother's work. In fact, the whole town, a medieval crusader citadel, much of it in ruins, seemed to be empty that day and was pervaded by a dirty yellow light, storm clouds hovering on the eastern seaboard in anticipation of the torrential downpour that would be unleashed that evening. But these modern Greek poets, Kavafi especially, did more for my literary imagination than anyone in the English canon, more even than Borges and his Spanish language writers of the next and my own generation, whose work I later came to study and in some cases translate. As I have said, those years in Greece were followed by several more of aimless peregrination around the Mediterranean, east and west. And I have chosen to read a piece from The Vagabond's Breakfast that invokes that restless, questing sense of rootlessness and anomie that shadowed me for much of that decade. I'll call this piece Stuck Inside of Mobile. When I try to revisit in my memory, in what counts for memory, that shadowy recess that claims knowledge of any one of those moments which have slipped beyond easy recall, I cannot help but conjure, alongside the actual sequence of events, a plethora of alternative outcomes of the things that might have happened next but didn't, the numerous possible developments that could have been subsequent to each isolate action, the taking of another turning along the almost endless roads of my frequently aimless or random travels, the decision to stay another night, another day, for yet another drink, for the rain to pass, or as once occurred, and this I can recall quite distinctly, one penniless and leaden afternoon while walking some interminable road in Sicily and composing in my head a new rendition of Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, turning the verses around and around with a melody that I remember still, singing loud and walking with obtuse abandon across the barren center of the island towards Palermo, for reasons which, however, I forget, shortly before a van pulled up, and I climbed in, and the two men, driver and passenger, brothers no doubt, or cousins, one of them, the passenger, with boils on his neck, half covered by the collar of his jacket, asked me if I was available for work, and if so, was I interested in employment as a shepherd, a guardian of sheep, looking after their family's flock. There was about them something persuasively medieval, and I thought about this unusual request for a while as the landscape accelerated past me in a way that suggested quite another country to the one through which I had until then been walking at an idle pace. Walking always presents the landscape as a constant and necessary interlocutor or adjunct to the interminable dialogue of the self, and told them in my rickety but ambitious Italian, in which I attempted to compensate by improvisation what I lacked in vocabulary, that I didn't think the pastoral life was right for me, that I was heading for the city where friends awaited me, a fabrication, but also a potential truth. We never know from which asylum or harbourfront bar our friends are going to emerge. Not that I distrusted them entirely, but the proposal seemed so entirely preposterous that I was enchanted by it. Such things happened far too often when engaged in a life of aimless wandering, and only serve to show how tenuous are the routes we take, how already at the moment of their asking, I was imagining the rocky hillside and the pastures upon which I would stroll as the sheep grazed peacefully, and a large dog of indeterminate race and friendly disposition bounded at my side, and the simple shack or cottage to which I would retire at nightfall close by a tumbling brook, and where of an evening I would drink my soup and eat my beans and spicy sausage and record the modest happenings of the day in a tattered notebook. And as soon as I had dismissed this conjecture and had rejected their offer, in that moment in which the Arcadian fantasy had momentarily been conjured and abandoned, a choice was made, an option, albeit one which in all probability would have had an utterly tedious, farcical, or even tragic conclusion, was wiped from the slate, consigned to the void of things that did not happen nor ever would. And so why is it that these possible solutions, these outcomes that, however improbable, might have come to pass, hold such a sway over my memory, even now, many years after the event, and which, multiplied by several thousand such moments when a dice was thrown, a card called, an offer, will you come with me to Santorini? Accepted or turned down, continue to plant in me a shadow of the life not lived. And this I need to get quite right. This I need to emphasize with all the means at my disposal, which are the words I write. The experience is not one of sadness or regret for a path not taken, but a fluttering excitement, a fleeting, evanescent thrill at the thorough randomness of all existence, of the multitude of choices laid before me every day that I lived as a wanderer and a vagrant, at times igniting in me an almost religious zeal at not being beholden to anyone or anything, the purest fusion of detachment and of participation, that perpetual paradox, to be there and yet to be elsewhere, to be one and yet to be the other. Because wherever I traveled, I sensed that, however dire the circumstances, once you have learned to trust in the imagination, anything and everything seems possible. The passage I have just read is composed of two long sentences, the first containing around 250 words, the second 550. This tendency to write long sentences is not something that I claim to be especially original, but it is certainly not a typical feature of writing in English, in which, in most creative writing classes, preference is given to the short, clear sentence, an inheritance associated with the pervasive influence of writers such as Hemingway and Carver, or else Carver as edited by Gordon Lish. I am far more inclined to the argument put forward by the Australian writer Gerald Murnane, who has said in defense of his own long sentences that he is trying to compose a labyrinth of statements, each comparatively simple in itself, but all of them able to be strung together or opposed to one another, so as to suggest some subtle and changeable state of mind. We are back with the creature of language. Of course, it is not enough simply to be writing long sentences as some sort of solipsistic delight. The long sentence only works in juxtaposition to the shorter sentence, and the long sentence only works if its rhythms and shifts of tempo serve a purpose. In this case, I would argue, corresponding with the wistful and rambling undulations of the narrator's thoughts as he passes through the Sicilian landscape. I believe my preference for the long, winding sentence might also have something to do with my love of the twists and turns of the route, rather than the destination. And it is these mellifluous and mysterious wanderings through syntax, with ideas enveloping other ideas, continuously embedded and enfolded in further subordinate clauses, which most aptly represents the workings of the mind. Samantha Harvey reminds us of this in her recent book on insomnia, The Shapeless Unease. We tend to speak in sentences of multiple clauses, she writes, not in clauses that have been separated out. Noam Chomsky has called these multiple clauses instances of recursion, and he thinks they're what define human language. They reflect our unique ability to position a thought inside a thought, to move from the immediate to the abstract, to infinite other places and times. There is no limit to the mind's capacity to embed one thought inside another. Our language is recursive because our minds are recursive. There is another possible explanation for my love of the long recursive sentence, which does not negate the one I've just offered, but which, if anything, corroborates it. Shortly before writing the passage I have just cited, in 2007, I was extremely unwell and awaiting a major operation. Because I found it difficult to concentrate on reading for extended periods, I listened to audiobooks. And one of the books I chose to listen to was Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which at this time, this was the days before Audible, came on 35 compact discs. I would listen to Proust's story day after day, but would inevitably fall asleep after half an hour or so. And the disc would keep playing, with the result that there were many discs I listened to time and time again in order to reach the parts that I had missed when I fell asleep. Proust's achievement for me therefore resembles a single slowly unwinding sentence, a sentence that contains infinite possibilities and no resolution. But there were other writers who influenced my love of the longer sentence, notably Thomas Bernhard and Javier Marias. It is noteworthy that none of these three writers wrote in English, and I read far more fiction than in translation than I ever read work originally written in English. I'm often asked about my influences. If I think about how influence works, I begin to differentiate between the writers I merely like and enjoy and the writers whose work has cast its shadow on my own. And I end up identifying those writers who make me want to write as those who are most important to me. I've mentioned the Greek poets of the last century. Reading the French poet Jean Follin's poems makes me want to write. And reading John Berger's and Joan Didion's essays makes me want to write. And so do Mavis Gallant's and Paul Bowles's short stories, but they don't necessarily make me want to write in the same genre as them. Another writer whose work makes me want to write is W.G. Sebald, who himself addressed the matter of influence revealingly when he said in an interview that he was always influenced by Thomas Bernhard, but didn't want to declare that openly because, I quote, then immediately one gets put in a drawer which says Thomas Bernhard, a follower of Thomas Bernhard, etc. And these labels never go away. So, bearing in mind Sebald's anxiety of influence, it seems to me to be an error to acknowledge too readily who one's influences are. Firstly, because, as he says, they allow you to be categorized or pigeonholed, but also because one's influences are not always clear or even clearly literary. I would consider my own influences to have emerged from cinema, especially the works of directors such as David Lynch and Werner Herzog, from visual artists such as Leonora Carrington and Anselm Kiefer, and from the music I listen to when writing, which varies drastically from book to book. When writing my first novel, The Color of a Dog Running Away, I listened to a lot of medieval choral music, for example. For Deep Hanging Out, I listened to Greek rambetica music. And for my current book, Ambassador of Nowhere, I have listened to contemporary drone music by composers such as Stars of the Lid, William Basinski, and Sarah Davachi. These also must be classed as influences. For my final reading, I've selected something from an unpublished work, a travel memoir titled Ambassador of Nowhere. It reflects on one of a series of journeys that I took across Latin America between 2011 and 2015, when I was collecting poems for an anthology of Latin American poetry called The Other Tiger and published by Seren in 2016. This section is set on a Saturday night in the port of Veracruz in Mexico. After I've read this, I'd be happy to take questions. Saturday night in Veracruz. That night, in my hotel on the Zocalo, the city's central square, I venture downstairs and sit on the terrace of the bar. The noise is shattering. There are several bands playing in the plaza, which, to use a common analogy, is the size of 3 football pitches. Nearby is a group of bikers from, according to the inscriptions on their leathers, San Luis de Potosí, who have parked their machines in the southwest corner of the square and planted massive speakers alongside them, from which blasts heavy metal at a volume which smothers most of the other sources of sound, the throbbing bass lines reverberating with an echo in the hollow of my gut. Just as in other countries, the bikers are predominantly middle-aged boy men wearing inscribed black t-shirts that barely cover their bulging bellies. They rev the engines of their Harleys, sending out a deafening challenge to the mariachi band playing closest to their patch. There are, however, at least 4 other mariachi bands sounding off just now, and a larger band for the dancers further down the square. To add to the cacophony, hundreds of birds occupying the many trees around the plaza maintain a shrill and maniacal chirruping, flitting frantically from perch to perch en masse, dislodging a rival group from a neighboring tree, which fly off, squawking in complaint, to find another haven. Police sirens and an unremitting blasting of horns from the bumper-to-bumper traffic add to the great commotion. A fresh contingent of mariachi trumpeters arrive to my right, offering a more immediate assault to the eardrums. This is, quite simply, the noisiest place I have ever been. I was told to expect a lot of noise, but nothing could have prepared me for this oral onslaught. It is beyond the tolerable limits of sound, a dense geological layering of noise upon noise, a sonic assault of massive dimensions. Outside in the street, a big red Ford truck pulls up and 5 fat men pile out. At the table in front of me, a smartly dressed man with European features is writing in an A4 pad. What is he writing? Amid all this blaring, toxic racket, could there be a second scribe, my double, doing exactly as I am doing? Could he, at this very moment, be describing how there is this person seated behind him, a cover version of himself? I conjure with the possibility that he is a spy, inspired no doubt by the short story I was reading on the bus journey down from Jalapa. In The Wanderer by Luisa Valenzuela, the female protagonist seems to enter into or be entered by, effectively the same thing, the novel she is reading, a theme that also appears in Julio Cortázar's story, The Continuity of Parks, in which the realities of the reader and the story being read interweave, tilting into one another to create a mesh in which the actual reader, the fictional reader, and the story itself become indistinguishable. In a similar way, I feel as though the man at the next table, writing in his notebook, is somehow vitally connected to my own experience of the evening. Could it be that the man at the table in front of me, the putative spy, is writing an account that mirrors my own? That he is spying on me just as I am spying on him? More worrying still, if I allow him to enter my account, might his story become my own? But perhaps this is all a delusion, and writing belongs to no one. Writing, according to Maurice Blanchot, is to pass from the first to the third person, so that what happens to me happens to no one, is anonymous insofar as it concerns me, repeats itself in an infinite dispersal. Could it be that there is always another doing exactly what you are doing, thinking your thoughts, writing your story, singing your song? You can resist him or you can be him, but you cannot make him go away for good. He will always be back, like the cat in that old episode of Sesame Street, impervious to expulsion or drowning or kidnap or being fired from the mouth of a cannon. However you might contrive to rid yourself of that cat, you will always fail, and the cat will always be back. Most of the tables are filled with Mexican holidaymakers or weekenders, and to my right sits a small, slight gringo who bears more than a passing resemblance to Stan Laurel and wears a forlorn moustache and camouflage cargo shorts and a t-shirt with an inscription that I can't read without standing in front of him and peering, which I have no intention of doing. He is talking to his much larger Mexican friend in English. The Mexican begins every other sentence with the words "one day," regardless of the construction that follows, and he terminates many of his utterances incongruously with the Spanish words esto y esto y esto, and so on. One day I crossed the ocean and came to Veracruz and sat on the terrace of a bar, listening to a man at the next table talk to his friend or accomplice or partner in crime. One day I this, one day I that, y esto, y esto, y esto. My double gets up to leave. He reaches down and from the floor picks up a hard yellow hat of the kind worn on construction sites. This was not in the script. It dawns on me that he is a person impersonator, posing as a surveyor or building site manager, and in this capacity was busy filing a report on the building under construction, or on the weather, or on me. I am not sure I entirely trust his departure. He will not be away for long. The Mexican who is sitting with Stan Laurel is doing most of the talking, while Stan, who may or may not be listening, nods his head sagely. The other man is becoming animated and his big round face is wet with perspiration. He says, or I think I hear him say, "One day you will see where went the elephant." Next he says, "One day you won't fuck with me or you won't talk up the history of conscious memory." But that surely cannot be right. I must be mishearing. And then he says, especially loudly, and I hear this for real, "One day she will say, I work every day, every day, every day. Shit, some days I don't give passion. Shit." The bikers amble by in a large group. They are wearing a uniform of those black t-shirts, black leather waistcoats, or vests, as they say in the US, and blue jeans. In the square itself, I can see jugglers and clowns and drag artists and con artists and little stalls selling cigars and wooden toys and junk of every possible description. A very young woman with a haunted look and delicate features carrying a child in a sling on her back comes by selling knickknacks made from woven thread. The pair to my right, who I realize now are quite drunk, each give her a 20 peso note, about £1. The gringo pointing insistently to the child as he hands his offering to the mother, as if to say, "The money is for her, and it's because of her, your child, that I am bestowing such munificence on you." Alcohol-driven largesse. The woman in the group at the table directly in front of me hisses loudly to catch the waiter's attention. He ignores her. She tries again, calling, "Joven," young man, instead, which works, and he half turns, careful not to dislodge any of the bottles and glasses he carries with acrobatic skill on a tray held high above his head. The shiny black wooden surface of my table reflects the revolving overhead fan above me, turning the tabletop into a spiraling vortex, inviting me in. I stare for a long time into this swirling mirage. It strikes me with the gratification that accompanies a rare insight that I don't truly know anything and probably never will, accepting perhaps the smallest details of a single life, things which can barely be summarized, let alone communicated. But at least in the fragments that are granted me, I have the salvation of continuity and can enjoy the exquisite tension of the unfinished journey.